It's the worst health emergency we've faced in a century. COVID-19 has killed more than 200,000 people and infected over 3 million. But could the uncomfortable truth be that humankind brought this pandemic upon itself? I'm Imran Gata, and on Newsmakers today, we look at the link between the coronavirus and the environment. With the human species largely locked up at home, it looks like nature is thriving. Venice's canals are clearer, New Delhi's skies are blue, and near Cape Town, penguins waddle through empty streets. Since COVID-19 paused our way of life, the natural world has been flourishing. Now, some leading conservationists are asking the question, did human behavior contribute to this deadly outbreak? The coronavirus is thought to have originated in bats and then somehow made its way to us. Biologists say that process has been made all the more likely after decades of destroying wildlife habitats and changing the climate. In our mistreatment of the planet, are we humans ultimately responsible for the pandemic? Haider Abbasi has more.
Deserted cities are being taken over. As humans retreat in the face of the pandemic, nature is being more daring. From deer in London's streets to dolphins in the Bosphorus, wildlife is flourishing in the time of the coronavirus. The absence of humans is being felt everywhere. This is New Delhi. The Indian capital is notorious for its smog, but now that pollution has all but disappeared. Such scenes reveal the impact of human activity on the environment. Some researchers believe it's our disregard for nature that's led to the rise of COVID-19.
We know that the destruction of nature leads to the destruction of habitat, and that this is one of the reasons for pandemics. And with that knowledge, we simply have to act more decisively now. We have already laid this out in the first report of the World Biodiversity Council. But now is a real wake-up call to do more if we want to avoid pandemics in the future.
In what ways has human behavior made pandemics more likely? Deforestation, overfishing, industrial farming. Environmentalists say it's these kinds of destructive activities that are making it easier for viruses to jump from animals to humans. Forced out of their natural surroundings, an animal's immune system can be weakened, allowing their pathogens to spread. And as they flee to find new homes, they bring diseases with them. The result is this: 2/3 of all infectious diseases in humans have their origins in animals. Another way is by killing predators, allowing their prey, such as rats, to multiply and further spread their viruses. Activists say climate change and its impact on biodiversity can also increase the risk of an outbreak. But it seems action on climate change has taken a back seat as countries deal with the coronavirus pandemic. As COVID-19 disrupts lives and devastates economies, will governments do more to stop disrupting and devastating the natural world, which may have got us into this crisis in the first place? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in Copenhagen is the Executive Director of the UN's Environment Programme, Andersen. And in Wrexham, Wales in the UK is John Vidal. He's a journalist and the former environment editor for The Guardian newspaper. Really good to have you both on the program. Thank you very much for joining us. Andersen, let me start with you, ma'am. You've been quoted as saying, nature is sending us a message with the coronavirus pandemic and the ongoing climate crisis, according to the UN's environment chief. Pretty big headline there, right? That stood out for a lot of us. It's one of the reasons why we've decided to do this program. Tell me exactly what you mean.
Well, if we think about it, we have as a species, humankind, altered about 75% of the Earth's surface. Farming, infrastructure, or exploitation, etc. And we have proactively traded and moved species around, species that are supposed to live in very distinct ecosystems. We've essentially backed them up against the wall, either in smaller and smaller habitats or caused greater and greater risk towards extinction. All of that means that we humans are coming into much closer contact with species and we are bringing species that are supposed to be living in very distinct places into contact with one another. That's not how it's supposed to be. And we know that today, the infectious diseases that we have amongst humans, about 60% of these come from zoonosis, i.e. from animals, often with an intermediary species that brings it to us, a bat, a flea, a rat, etc. And we know that about 75% of new new diseases are zoonotic in nature. So the question we have to ask ourselves, how can we leave what I refer to as the wild, wild? How can we leave remote, remote? How can we ensure that we take care of not continuing to fragment our pristine areas? And how can we ensure that trade in species illegal trade in species is halted and illegal wet markets are halted? These are the kind of actions that we need to take. And it's not like those of us who work on biology and biodiversity, didn't know that. We've been saying it for a long time. In fact, UNEP published a report in 2016 on this issue. The issue is that people haven't quite understood that human health and planetary health are intimately connected and are essentially part of the same spectrum.
So, John, would you concur with that? The fact that we're fiddling too much, our destruction of natural habitats, our destruction of natural biodiversity is contributing to making these pandemics much worse than they could be?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's not just much worse. They're becoming more frequent. They're becoming more serious. We've seen over the last 30, 40 years, all kinds of emerging diseases come out. So many of them are linked absolutely directly with deforestation, with intensive farming, with the way we treat nature. And your report was very, very good to start with. It absolutely hit it on the nail. These are man-made diseases. We are absolutely responsible. And unless we change fairly radically the way we farm, the way we live, we're going to see far more of them, far more frequently, and far more intensely.
So, John, when you say these diseases are man-made, people would look at the lesson of history and say, well, hold on a second. Black Death, Spanish flu, these things happened a long time before we started, mucking about, right? Aren't pandemics, viral epidemics, bacterial epidemics, whatever, aren't they part and parcel of nature?
You're absolutely right. There've been, in the last 500 years, there've been about 50 major pandemics. What we've seen in the last 30 years is about 30 or 40 of them. So in other words, they're coming much more frequently, much more seriously than they used to. In the past, you had the very occasional one which spread right the way around the world. Okay. Nowadays, you're getting very many smaller ones, most of which are put out fairly quickly, but occasionally, like COVID, this is getting right the way around very, very quickly. So unfortunately, it's a very serious problem now.
Right. Inge Andersen, is it a hard sell, Ms. Andersen, given that in the midst of a pandemic, people might know others who are in hospital. You might know someone. This could be your mother, could be your brother, who's desperately gasping for air and gasping for life and who has coronavirus in hospital, in an emergency room somewhere. And then they read a headline that says, we did this to ourselves, right? In some ways, it could almost sound as if a sort of secular version of there's an earthquake and God is punishing us for our sins, or HIV is punishment for how gay people love each other and so on. People would react very defensively to that because they say, well, I didn't do anything to spread this virus. Why are you blaming me for my suffering?
Well, look, first of all, we have to obviously treat this pandemic as a health emergency that it is, and have compassion and care and invest in good and sound integrated health service. Let's make no mistake about that. Right now, human health is before anything the United Nations priority. But we need to understand where these diseases come from. And that's the issue here. As you rightly heard from John, we are seeing a much greater frequency of these pandemics in the last 30 or plus minus years. And you can, Ebola, Marburg, West Nile virus, Zika, bird flu, H1N1. They're coming at a furious speed, and we need to understand why. And so, like any good doctor, you would go in and diagnose, and you would quickly give the medicine. Now, unfortunately, in this case, you can't. But you also will understand how come this disease is happening. And what I think we are saying is, look, let's go to the root causes of this. Yes, it is existing in the human population, but how did it get there? And what action is it that we as humanity need to take to ensure that it doesn't do that again? And so in the United Nations, we have a number of conventions that deal with biological diversity. One, which is the Biodiversity Convention. It's sort of the sister convention, if you like, to the Climate Change Convention, both agreed at the same time in 92. And here, what the next Conference of Parties, COP, that will come up, we are calling for, under this convention, a very ambitious agreement with the means of implementation and money behind it and political understanding of why this matters. So no, I do not want to not be compassionate to that relative in a hospital. That has to be the first priority, obviously. Right. But it's going to be a good cause.
And John Vidal, the reason I ask this is because we've seen major cultural differences here, and we've seen culture wars being played out. And on the sort of extreme end of that, we've seen a lot of racism towards Chinese people, for example, right? So, okay, I get it with the wet markets, for example, right? We treat these animals so badly that they secrete these pathogens, they get sick. We're more likely to get their flus and colds and so on, right? From bats and pangolins and so on. But then you have many of us sitting maybe in our ivory towers condemning the wet markets. This is a livelihood for a lot of people. We eat chicken without any worry. We're beneficiaries of a daily chicken holocaust, if you like. But we go, all those Chinese people, you know, they eat those disgusting things, and it's gonna give us disease. Do you get what I'm talking about here? There seems to be a great difficulty of people talking sort of past each other here, which means that nothing might actually get done. John?
I completely agree with you. I think it's absolutely terrible that all the blame is going on China, all the blame is going on the wet markets. It's not like that. Africa, for instance, a very large percentage of food for very many millions of people comes directly from nature. Now, this is not endangered species. These are quite common animals or whatever. The nutrition provided by wild animals, especially in Africa, is fantastically important. Now, were we to ban all the markets, all the wild markets, just like that, we would add enormously, I think, to malnutrition in some very, very vulnerable places. Now, there is good sales of wild food, and there's bad. And some of the wet markets are clearly out of order. But that is a problem of the authorities, of vets not being properly watched or invigilated. So we need to ban absolutely the bad ones, but we must take care that we don't, in so doing, make it worse for the most vulnerable, who actually have very little money and who have traditionally relied on wild food for an awful lot of their nutrition.
Inge Andersen, what has been the response to your recent comments? I know you've been campaigning for a long time. As you mentioned, you issued a report in 2016 sounding the alarm that this might happen. But in the midst of this pandemic, give us some ideas about what you've heard from people and whether people are partial to this idea that we need to maybe fundamentally change the way we've been doing things up until now if we don't want a repeat of this.
I think that there's been a very positive reception because we, as I keep saying, clearly taking care of people has to be the primary task. But looking at the longer term, we need to get better health systems, but we need to look at how we integrate with nature. And here the beauty of this is that this is where biodiversity and climate comes hand in hand. By ensuring that we restore degraded ecosystem with new with indigenous biomass, by protecting tropical forests, by doing landscape restoration, by protecting blue carbon. Each of these assets, these natural assets, are not only good for climate and carbon storage, but are also good for ensuring healthy ecosystems, and therefore by ensuring that diversity can thrive. There are some early studies, but more studies are needed, that show that where diversity is low, you tend to see more transmission of pathogens. Where diversity is high, it is lower. Now, more study is needed, I hasten to add. But these are important elements. So no, I found a lot of positive receptivity, respecting, of course, human health as number one.
John Vidal, the clearer skies, the more breathable air, the fewer emissions of fossil fuels, that's all temporary, isn't it? Because when economies open up again, they're not going to say, hey, we submit to the lessons that we learned during COVID-19 when we were all at home. They're going to binge. They're going to go and spend, and they're going to unleash hell on the environment, aren't they?
You may be right, and I fear you may be, but I think that nobody really wants to go back to the normal we had before. I think there is a very wide desire, certainly in some countries, that we actually come out of this with a better relationship with nature, that we think again about how we're treating nature, and therefore we can get benefit from it. And it's a very, very good time to step back and to say, well, what have we learned from this? And the one thing which I think UNEP and others have shown is absolutely that there is a message for nature and from nature here, that unless we change, we are going to go down a road which is so dangerous and so full of future pandemics and catastrophe that we really don't want to. So now we have got the chance. And I think the politicians in many, many countries are beginning to understand that.
Inga Andersen, economies have been hit hard. People are suffering financially around the world. As we flatten the curve, as we get a hold of the infection rates, economies are going to want to explode with activity. We have to do things in order to stimulate the economies. What would you tell leaders in business, politicians, and so on, about what to do once they want to open up their economies?
Well, what we're saying is, look, the first sort of wave of stimulus package that's already out there has been one to put money in people's pockets, and that's a right thing to do. So no question, social protection, especially solidarity towards the poorest, right? But thereafter, there will be a need, as you rightly say, to stimulate job growth, to stimulate opportunity again. And here there's a massive opportunity to build back better, invest in green, invest and ensuring that those hard infrastructure investments, that they come online with job opportunity, but also with greener and cleaner. And as we know well, after crisis, there tends to be a lot of infrastructure type projects. So let's think public transport. Let's think integrating bicycles where it's feasible. Let's think, obviously, renewable energy. Let's think green cities and parks with and spaces for people. So finding ways of making jobs and growth. And of course, bottom line, finding ways of supporting sustainable production and consumption, cleaner productivity modalities. That's what we needed to do anyway. And here there is an opportunity, because there will be massive stimulus packages coming out, as there should be, and make them green, build back better. That's the way. That's a real opportunity that we have before us now.
John Vidal, as somebody who was the former environment editor at The Guardian, I wonder, when people talk about our role as human beings and our relationship to our environment, the environment, climate change, and so on, has it changed over the years?
I think it is changing. I think that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, government saw environment as an add-on. It was a little extra. They weren't very interested, frankly, nor were newspapers, I have to say. It has changed all the time. Now, part of that has been the debate about climate disasters and climate change. And what COVID has showed us is that even a massive takedown of industry has really only reduced the impact on climate very, very marginally. And therefore, that the real battle has yet to be even engaged. We have got to reduce our impact on the environment right across the board on an enormous scale. Now, I really do believe that governments are open and willing to think of new ideas. There has to be a much more global approach to this. And biodiversity and climate change are going to be the keys to it. Everything we can do for the one will work for the other. So it's a win-win-win. We can defeat infectious diseases, we can improve the environment, and we can improve our economies. It's a fantastic chance.
Inga Andersen, I'm curious about the reaction to the science from a lot of governments, because something that's interesting here, when we look at climate change, for example, at the very highest levels of government, we've had people question the climate science. Donald Trump has in the past, and others, leaders of other countries and so on. When it comes to COVID-19, such has been the tangible physical impact across the world from country to country, even though we might have had Bolsonaro and one or two others question whether lockdowns are necessary or not, we haven't really seen any major outliers. Any countries coming out and saying this is all nonsense, there's no way this is going to kill people, it's all a myth, it's all a CIA conspiracy or whatever you can think of. Does it encourage you that, broadly speaking, the nation states have listened to the experts and they've trusted the science? So even when they've chosen something like not fully locking down, it's been rooted in a scientific concept of herd immunity, for example. So even that is sort of rooted in science. Does that encourage you?
Well, encourage is a strong word, but I think certainly the fact that science has spoken, I mean, it's irrefutable, obviously. People are dying. This has a very, very rapid spread. So it's hard to, quote unquote, deny these facts. And so I think there, because it's so immediate on our well-being as a civilization, it's understood. Where it has been more difficult for science to communicate has been, you mentioned climate change, but let's make no mistake. This is a small, we will get through Corona. There will be terrible consequences because of all the lives lost, but we will, as a civilization and humanity, get through it. But on climate change, we cannot even begin to imagine what that is. And maybe because it's a little bit further out, it's harder for some to understand this. But unlike Corona, which you can end the epidemic, even if not end COVID-19 in society, you can't end climate change once you're past a certain tipping point, which is why action now on climate is so critical. So climate action and science has communicated for decades, and the science stands irrefutably. And it is certainly time now to take the opportunity, I'm sorry to say, in the middle of this catastrophic crisis, to take climate positive action, because we cannot afford not to do so.
John Vidal, why is it so hard to convince people that the same scientists, the same principles that are relaying all this information about the coronavirus to you, all of that is also at play when it comes to the fact that we are involved in altering our climate, the earth is warming, and this is not good, and therefore we need to do something about it? Why are people more readily accepting of the one and not the other?
I think traditionally we've always seen animal health, human health, and ecological health, if you like, the health of the planet, as three totally separate disciplines, and that each one should be addressed separately. And we've built up very, very good academic disciplines around each one. This is the time where we must begin to understand that the three go together, that unless we look after animal health, we're not going to look after human health, and vice versa with ecological health. Unless we look after the health of the forests or the savannas, we are not going to be able to look after our own health. So there's this enormously simple message, but we've had it for 30, 40, 50 years, that the disciplines of health have been separated. Now's the time to change that.
Inga Andersen, as our final contribution on the program, to those who are watching this and asking the question, well, what can I do personally? Your message to them is what?
Be active in your community, be active in your country. Think about your own life choices, teach the children well. I think change is made by people, and people influence politicians, and politicians run countries. So be very active and get the facts. The facts speak for themselves. And then when the COVID, obviously do all the things that the health authorities advise for you to do, but look beyond that so that we can get to the root cause.
Okay, Inga Andersen and John Vidal, it's been a pleasure talking to you both about this ever-evolving situation. It's been really good to pick your brains. I thank you very much for joining us here on this episode of The Newsmakers.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.